our recording. I believe as of tomorrow night, 11:59, you will no longer get credit for making edits to the technique summary. Okay? So as of tomorrow night, 11:59, if you haven't put in any edits, you will get a 0 for the assignment. Right? It will not be graded, but what's going to happen is I'm going to go through and, or what I'm allowing is it to open up, and now anybody can go through and edit and make it better. Okay? So the intent of the technique summary is that you should be able to look at a relatively small section, say column chromatography, and know fairly quickly what it does and how it does it. Okay, that's kind of the goal. It's supposed to summarize what you learned about that technique, and ideally less than half a page. That's kind of the target goal. You bring in pictures. I'm not really going to count the pictures towards it unless you're trying to put in full page pictures. Then I might get a little whiny about it. So as long as your summary is a page or less, you're okay. If the summary is more than a page, you're doing something wrong and it needs to be fixed. Okay? And we'll talk about kind of the details of that grading in a little bit. To get credit, you just have to go through and document that you've made edits, that you've organized. That's fine. Screenshot what you've done and put that into Canvas. Where in Canvas? In one of the 3 or 4 technique assignments. Okay? Ultimately, I don't really care which one as long as it's there, because then I can get you credit. Does that make sense? Okay, so if you've not made edits, you need to start figuring out edits. So go through, review what's in the document, figure it out, okay, and then post that to Canvas so I can get you credit for the assignment. Okay. After this Friday, up to May 2nd, anybody can go through and edit and clean it up however they feel fit. So if you think there's too much in one area, at this point you're now figuring out, let's polish this for a final group grade. That's the intent. Okay? I was trying to prevent people from doing that early on because I wanted everybody to have the opportunity to contribute. Make sense? Okay. Which will double back to announcements. I'm going to regret doing that, but I did it anyway. If we double back to our announcements, our technique summary reminder is here. This is kind of small, but for the sake of the recording, it's not going to be useful, but you now know where to find it. The big guiding principles are the things that you're trying to kind of target as you go through. So some of them are kind of big picture things. Do you have all the techniques addressed? Okay. And if you're wondering what techniques need to be addressed, they're in the directions of that document. Okay, they're up at the top. So if we look all the way up at the top for this one, you've got your techniques already listed out. Okay, where did it go? Let's double back. Critical pieces necessary to understand the technique. Okay, this is going to take some practice, but remember you went through and did this technique. Did you screw something up in lab? Why did you screw it up? Okay, that was probably some critical piece of information that you should have known before going in. So that would be a good thing to kind of highlight and identify. Okay? Do not get insulted if someone decides that that wasn't critical and deletes it later. That's fine. That is perfectly acceptable and okay. This is why the document is supposed to be anonymous. Okay? I know 2 of you have not been anonymous, but whatever. Okay? Are the outcomes of the technique identified? Remember, within our techniques, we have separation, purification, and identification. It already looked like you guys have started to highlight that. I don't know if it's consistent, but at least showed up. So we've got active extraction right there at the top, separation, purification technique. I would argue that's good organization. You very clearly identified what the technique is about. As I slowly scroll back. How are the outcomes of each technique identified? So if you do melting point, if we do the extraction, because we just saw that, was separation or purification. Okay? I would argue it's only just separation, not purification. Purification is refined. Extraction is more just separation. It's bulk separation, okay? Not a refined technique. Calling it purification is fine. I'm not going to take off points for that. That's just my 2 cents. if that's the outcome, how do you know that you were successful? How do you assess that that was proper, that it actually separated? Right? How would you know that? Provide some information about it. You don't have to provide the detail behind it, because for extraction, how did you assign success? How do you know you separated? What's that? You got product. What color was your product?
From our lab or extraction on the last one we just did?
From any time you did an extraction.
Clear.
Okay, clear. What color was it beforehand?
Clear. White.
How did you just prove that your technique was successful if you started with a clear liquid and you ended with a clear liquid? Okay, so we could use melting point. Okay, and now how is the melting point useful? Okay, you could direct from the extraction and say melting point is how this gets assessed, and then you could say see melting point. You don't have to explain what's going on within it, but your melting point should now go through and explain. Okay, so you have to make sure that context is now provided up in the melting point situation. Does that make sense? Is this a summary or is it a copy paste of the background information? So a number of times that this happens, people are just copying and pasting the text that I've already written. This is supposed to be you, not me. Okay, I know mostly what I wrote. Okay, I don't need that repeated back to me. You need to take ownership of this content. Okay, half a page per technique, not including figures. Okay, that's kind of a big one. If you're floating a little over half a page, it's probably okay. This doesn't mean you should adjust margins, okay, to force it up into that half page range. If you feel like, I feel like this is a little long, it probably is. So figure out ways or areas that you think need to get removed. And if you really think nothing should be removed, to cover your bases, you could add a comment and be like, Mike, don't take off points. All this is important. Okay, that's okay too. Are the figures relevant? Okay, this one becomes important because a lot of times what I'll see is just pictures of the lab. The hell does that show? Okay, make sure that your picture is actually useful to what's being addressed. Okay, and then are we factually correct? Generally speaking, that's fine. And then navigate, understand, visualize. Right? Again, at least what you guys already have set up here is looking pretty legitimate. Okay, the extraction, as we kind of read this a little bit more detailed, feels a lot of like this is just a procedure. It's not supposed to be a procedure. It's supposed to summarize the idea behind what's going on. Okay, and even then, with the extraction, this makes it sound like it's a procedure. You're going in order. Was the extraction a linear thing? So if you really wanted to get some idea of the extraction, what would be a better way to summarize the procedure and the idea behind it than a linear procedure?
Say what each step is doing?
The flow chart.
Oh, that.
Okay? That's how we talked through it before we started, for a good reason. It organizes kind of that thought process. Kind of makes sense? Okay? This also suggests that to do an extraction, you have to use HCl. Did you use HCl in the last lab for ionome? Did you do an extraction? Yeah. This is already pigeonholing your experiment, not the technique. So you've got to be careful in finding that line. And sometimes it's easier said than done. Okay, so you don't lose a lot of points for that area, but those are things I'm going to be looking at. Kind of make sense? Okay. Question about the technique summary. As in, sorry, let's try that again. Do you have questions about the technique summary? I always forget that part of the word. Okay. Last thing I'll mention about it, what I hope to do is, particularly if I like the technique summary, what I'm going to do is take the things that I like the most out and create a technique summary for 236. So for students that aren't coming from my class into second semester lab, they should have learned certain techniques. Every OChem class should have learned these techniques. Okay? But they may not remember it. You may not remember it. So having a cheat sheet to help kind of organize your flow for those individual techniques, I think makes a lot of sense. So it will be shared with people in the future. Make sense? Okay.
It won't really help with, so I'm sure it could help with lecture portion, but like, we don't want to think about. It's not, like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, you're saying I don't have to take labs, so I don't need to worry about this?
Not that I don't need to worry about it, but essentially, yeah.
Yeah, that's what you're saying. So you're saying I don't care about this grade, screw everybody else? Is that really what you're?
No, but,
Because that's kind of what I'm hearing.
well, no, I'm just saying, like, is it not gonna be as, like,
It wouldn't be as useful for you because the intent is to set up what's going on. It's supposed to set up a summary of what you learned this semester. So it still summarizes everything that you learned. I would argue, as we move into the next topic, being our practical, which is all about the active extraction technique, if that was summarized in a way that helped to kind of push the understanding, that might help you for the practical. Okay? Same deal, part of that is melting point. That could help you prepare for the practical. Does that make sense? But yes, you're right. Other questions about the technique summary? Grand scheme, the points are relatively minimal as well, so it's not something you should be panicking or stressing about. Okay? You should be trying to do the best that you can, but again, not a big stressor, hopefully. Okay? So we'll close that and we'll navigate, unfortunately, back to the modules and look at the rest of our semester. So week 12 was 2 weeks ago. Ion synthesis was last week. Week 14 is this week. So all of this stuff is done in person. Oh, shoot, I forgot to put the final quiz up there. Dang it. Are you guys ready for that, or do you have questions?
Final quiz.
Yeah, the final quiz. There's not a final quiz.
Good for you. I'll throw my shoe at you.
oh, my face.
I don't know.
Thank you, Andrew. You're still smiling.
You're such a fun.
I decided I didn't want to grade one. Is really what it came down to. So it is technically all entered into the grade book already as a 75. I just haven't published it so that you could see it. So there is no final quiz. You don't have to stress about that. But the next thing, what? Name calling? That's rude. Which then moves into next week being the practical. So the practical is 75 points. It is a pretty significant chunk of points, so we do got to watch out for that. Are you okay? I can scroll a little bit. So practical directions are provided. It is something that we're going to run next week. It is individual. Okay. I don't really care how we split this up, but we can't have everybody in the lab room at the same time for an individual experiment. It's just not going to work out logistically. So we'll split up the class in half. Half the class runs it in wave 1, half the class runs it in wave 2. Okay? If you can already work it out with your partner who does which wave, that's fine with me. We don't have to divide up. If you don't want to fight it out over who does wave 1 or wave 2, you both show up next week and I'll just go through and say. Does that make sense? Okay. It's 90 minutes. So first wave will start probably 1:10. So we'll get a little bit just to make sure people are in, get any kind of last second questions answered. Then we'll move into the lab and again, little bit of logistics stuff. Probably about 1:15 we'll start an official timer. Okay? At that point, you'll have an hour and a half, which should be 2:45? Yeah, 2:45? 2:45, you're done. Wave 1 is done. Okay, if you're still working, you will start accumulating late points. Okay, those would be negative points, so we don't want those. Okay, at 2:45, you're supposed to be out the door and done. All your glassware is supposed to be cleaned. That's part of lab. Okay, so it's in, do the experiment, get the results, clean everything up, out the door in 90 minutes. Okay? This individual technique can be done at easily, a little bit tight, but 3 times beginning to end. Okay? It requires some organization within that, but you should be able to complete it 3 times if you really wanted to within the 90 minutes. 4 times gets a little bit tight, but you could probably pull off 4 times. You should only do it once, for the record. Okay? I'm just trying to point out that you do have some room. Most of the issues that pop up is that people won't commit. Okay? They'll go through and say, well, I think I can get all the way through this. I know I made a mistake, but I think I can fix it. And you'll sit there and think about it. That's not productive timing. You have to commit. I'm either going to finish this or I'm going to restart. And if I'm going to restart, dump, restart. And move on. Okay? Your grade, pre-lab procedure. You're still allowed to come in with notes. Okay? So you can have one 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. A question was brought up about digital notes. Can you bring in like an iPad? Unfortunately, no. It's still going to have to be printed. But if you're going to do digital notes and handwrite things, that's fine. You just have to print it. And if you have trouble printing, that's also fine. Send me an email in advance with whatever you need printed, and I will print it. Okay, so I can have it and have it ready for you.
But we'll need our films for the melting point.
Say that again?
We'll need our films for the melting point.
You will need your phone or personal device for the melting point. I did forget about that. So, make sense? Okay. We'll come back to that pre-lab procedure in a little bit. In-lab observations, so you will be getting another sheet of paper when you get into lab. It will have mostly blank front page, blank half of the back page, where you will write whatever observations you want. Okay? You've been writing in labs. You've been receiving grades for in labs. You're going to get those same comments on this in lab. So make sure you take observations as you navigate the system. Okay? Next part, safety and techniques. Generally speaking, those are just going to be full credit. What things we'll watch out for: goggles, appropriate clothing, closed-toed shoes. When you're pipetting, do you keep the tip of the pipette down or are you turning it upright? A lot of that is just observational, what I see as I navigate. So you could do something horrendously wrong and I don't see it, I can't take off points. But if I see it, I'm going to take off points. Kind of make sense? Unknown yield and the unknown melting point are both worth 10 points. 5 of those points are in, are you getting what you should get? Do you know what you should get? No. And I'm not going to tell you. Okay? So for the yield, you go through, I got a 50% yield. Is that what you're supposed to get? Maybe. Okay? If that was what you're supposed to get, you get 5 points. You got a 55% yield. That's pretty close, 5 points. You got a 32% yield. That's a little on the low end, 4% or 4 points. Okay? You didn't get anything. That's going to be a 0. Okay? The other 5 points will now be your analysis of that. So yeah, you got a 50%. What do you think? Is that good? Is that bad? Why? Provide that analysis, kind of like what you've been doing with all your other experiments. Same thing goes for the melting point. The melting point is going to hit slightly differently because not only is it, are you hitting the value that you're supposed to get, which you don't know, okay? But are you hitting it for the correct substance? Okay? So if the melting point for salicylic acid is 157, but I told you to isolate the base, I don't care that you get a pure salicylic acid. You didn't isolate the thing I told you to isolate. Make sense? You then get another 5 points again on analyzing it. Okay? What should you be looking for in the analysis of your melting point? I wonder, do you have a technique summary that summarizes what you should be getting from important values within an individual experiment? I believe so. Yes. Cool. Clean lab bench, so your personal workspace, wherever you were working, is that and cleaned up and everything properly disposed of. Common space cleanliness, so the balance room, nobody owns that space, but that's a shared space. You have to ensure that that's cleaned up. Okay? So if you make a mess in there, you should clean it up and be kind to everybody else. But if you make a mess in there and I don't see that it's you, I can't blame you, I'm blaming the class. So the class would lose points. So that common space cleanliness belongs to the class. If you think you're done and you see a mess, you should probably clean up that mess or find out who did and tell them to clean it up. Make sense? That then just gets totaled up out of 75 points. Everybody does tend to panic about the practical. Generally speaking, it's not something worth panicking over. Okay? The hardest part of the practical is trying to focus in on what the technique does and how it works. Okay? Not the individual steps. Okay? So the things that I tend to summarize for the individual practical, based off of my overview of seeing people in the past, there's really two categories. The uber prepared category and the didn't prepare jack category. Of those two, the didn't prepare anything usually does better, okay, which is kind of shocking to me. Okay? The best case I've got, or the best example of this that I've got, a student came in literally with nothing except their goggles. They were wearing clothes too. Okay? See? You laugh. You can't shake your head, you're laughing. Okay. And then I gave them the in-lab sheet. They did the experiment. They actually had to borrow a pencil from me to complete it. They completed it, and they were like, here you go, I'm done. They had like half an hour left, and I was like, where's your pre-lab? Like, oh, I didn't think I needed one. I was like, it's part of the points, dude. Here's a blank sheet of paper. Write something down for a pre-lab. Perfect results. Okay. Didn't need to write a procedure because they understood what the procedure was trying to do. So if you understand, you don't need a big, gory, detailed procedure. Okay. The camp that usually over-prepares has a whole bunch of stuff written out. And when something goes slightly sideways and it doesn't fit that individual procedure, they crumble to pieces, okay? Which is very depressing for everybody, including me, okay? It's like, how can I help without helping to get you back on track so that you can be successful? But it happens, so try to pay attention to the understanding of how the technique works, and you should be better off. Okay, so that was 2 camps. There's now actually a 3rd camp because I tell everybody these stories and I get a camp now of students that come in with absolutely nothing and also no understanding because they were like, oh, the whole point was I shouldn't have anything and I'll do better. That's not what the story meant. The story meant you have to understand the technique. Okay? If you come in understanding the technique, your cheat sheet can be loose guidelines on what you should navigate. But that's all you'll need. But don't come in just like, oh, I didn't prepare anything, because yeah, that's not going to be successful either. Make sense? Questions? Okay. So that's our pre-lab procedure. The in-lab observations on that sheet towards the bottom on that front page, okay, it's going to say acid, base, neutral. I'm going to circle one of those and hand you the sheet. If I circle acid, you are isolating the organic acid. That's it. I don't care about the base. I don't care about the neutral. If I circle the neutral, you need to isolate the neutral organic product. That's it. We don't care about anything else. Make sense? Okay. Yeah. Questions about practical?
lab, just like on
Yep.
this picture.
in lab. So the bottom half of the flip side, it'll have a place for yield, a place for melting point, and then it'll have show your work for how you calculated the yield, and then explain what you think about it. And it'll say the same thing for the melting point. So you just have to explain what you think and saw. There is a place for a signature. I should sign off on your final mass. I will try to remember that, to remind everybody that when you think you've got your final product, I want to see it and verify that what the balance says. Make sense? Okay. Well, I've been talking for 25 minutes? Really? Feels like an hour. No other questions? Okay, I'm going to pause that recording.